talking tonight about compiling a collection of mentor texts, and we'll talk a little bit about what our various understandings of mentor texts are and what that means to you as well as to me. So basically the workshop goals are going to be to strengthen your understanding of conventions for writing in your discipline using mentor texts. And when I say conventions for writing, I'm not just talking about sentence level conventions. In many ways, when you are learning English as a second or third or fourth language, you have a much stronger understanding of grammar and structure than many of my American counterparts. But I also understand that when you're working with multiple languages, the flow and structure of those multiple languages can sometimes come together and cause confusion. But we'll look at conventions that relate to other expectations in scholarly writing as well. We'll also talk about some best practices for using mentor texts. So these again are best practices that I would love to invite you to share your own insights on. And I will have suggestions and feedback, but I'd love to hear your ideas too. And then to develop a plan for assembling a portfolio of mentor texts. So we're going to talk a little bit about mentor texts, and I'm going to kind of in a big picture way break it into genres and best practices for addressing genres. So let's go first to genres. And whoops, sorry, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So how do you think of genres? What does that mean to you? Kind of keep that in mind. These conventions can shift. Genres can be different types of writing. Each can have its own set of conventions or expectations, such as many of the types of writing you mentioned, research studies, books reviews, concept analyses, literature reviews. More broadly, they can also include biographies, histories, poetry, short stories, historical novels, and so forth. So this evening, we'll be focusing on research articles in scholarly journals, but even within that, there are different sets of genre expectations and conventions depending on the discipline and depending on the purpose of the piece. And so what the point is going to be to think about more specific conventions of this particular genre of research articles within your own discipline. So part of how we'll be doing that is talking about mentor texts, just like any kind of mentor, someone or something that we can learn from. And they will all have different attributes that we can learn about too. For instance, I use syllabi and materials, lesson plans as mentor texts. I've done that. And sometimes that's a good example of where sometimes repetition becomes necessary. It depends on the purpose, right? Am I giving this sort of narrative description of the information in the tables? Or am I talking about it? Am I talking about the information with a purpose and sharing, what the implications are of that material? It depends on the purpose. But sometimes we have to use similar structures to share content, definitely. I want to ask a couple of questions again. One is, and these are things to think about. The first question is, do you have a writing for publication project in mind, or are you working on one at this moment? So kind of keep that in mind. You're also welcome to share. The other question is, what would be the most helpful types or genres of mentor text for you at this point in time? So again, we're going to look at some samples, and you will be able to work with your own material, but you want to be thinking about, what am I planning to write for publication, or what am I working on, and how can that help guide my choice of mentor text? So in terms of genre, we've talked about there are multiple genres, but you also, as you're thinking about pulling together a collection of helpful documents, you want to identify multiple genres in your own field, especially for scholarly work that you do, teaching work that you do, and also maybe community oriented or public oriented or policy related or government work, legal work, any other kind of facet of your work. So you're not simply focusing on just one type of document. Well, again, for the purposes of time and this workshop, we're going to keep it focused. What is really helpful is to identify a variety of genres that you might want at least one good model for each. You want to select from multiple genres too when you're building a collection of mentor texts for the same purpose. Is what are the different kinds of writing that you'll be working with? Obviously, it makes sense to start with the ones that will be in most demand for you. And then you want to make multiple selections within each genre. For instance, if you know that there's a particular journal you want to publish in, and you only focus on that journal, you will miss the broader conversation of research and scholarly conversation happening in your field. So while you do want to most definitely pull examples from a desired journal, scholarly journal, you also want to look at journals you may not have considered, or maybe you're not sure of for publication, because you might find other research or perspectives that you weren't aware of, or that just expand your insight into your own discipline. The other thing is, for each journal you choose, select 2 or 3 examples. And you want to, because you want to give yourself a variety of options to work from. You also want to maybe pay attention to what a specific journal, what kinds of manuscripts or papers or text does that journal publish. It's not just research articles. Obviously, that for many of us in one form or another is going to be our top choice. But what if you're a advanced graduate student, you don't have a lot of publications to your name, and while there's nothing wrong at all with submitting a manuscript to the journal with the highest impact factor in your field, there's also another goal, which is to get good writing published. So looking at a variety of journals, and then within them thinking about, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't have a finished research project, but I can do a literature review, or perhaps a book review. I might also be able to do a commentary. I can check with the editors to see if they would be interested in a commentary on someone else's article. So there are many, many opportunities. There are also other documents in your field. There are things like newsletters, professional magazines, which are a little less formal in structure than scholarly journals, but still very informative and professional. So let yourself, especially if you're still, you don't have a long list of publications or you haven't started yet, let yourself think beyond just your one desired journal. So the other thing in a big picture way we're going to be talking about is best practices. So I use the term diagram. In some ways, I'm thinking of diagramming more as annotating with a purpose. But I might, if I really want to, I can take a text and really add arrows and circles and call out boxes, the kinds of things you might find in a model, a visual model. But in this case, I'm really talking about breaking down the components of, say, of whatever the mentor text is, mindfully, thinking about what am I analyzing? What am I evaluating in this particular document, mentor text, at this time? Am I diagramming the organization? We're going to do an activity in a few minutes, and I'm going to have you start with what's going to feel like a very basic activity, which is to start listing the main point, section headings, that sort of thing. But there's a reason for why I'm having you do this. So just kind of, you'll work with that and we'll develop that from there. But you want to be thinking about, okay, am I diagramming for the content instead of organization? Am I looking at a specific section or subsection and looking at how it's focused? What is it focused on? What information, in other words, is it sharing with the reader? And what is the purpose of this information beyond just the obvious things, that it's not just explaining, but it's helping my readers understand a particular application of a particular strategy in this context or something. Another way you might diagram or annotate is for language use and conventions. I'm going to give you what's going to seem like a very simple activity, but it actually is a little more complex than you might think. And Maria, I see your note. So yes, even within a field, it is hard to create a text applicable for several journals at once. You are so right. There is a need to edit a text to meet each journal's special demands. And you're right, not only for formatting. I think Maria's point speaks to what I was saying a couple minutes ago, which is this is why you really want to look at a variety of mentor texts from a variety of journals, because every journal has its own standard and its own set of conventions. So you have sort of these general conventions, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, for scholarly writing. And then you have specific ways, strategies for these conventions within your discipline. And then each journal might have particular expectations of how to structure, format, explain, communicate information. You also want to be thinking about how you can use parts of documents as templates, which also speaks to Maria's question too, is, okay, I know that this journal expects this kind of abstract structure, but this journal wants me to be more narrative and flowy, while that one wants it to be much more structured, with even with headings, background, purpose, etc. So what you can do is pull an effective example or a published example of each kind of abstract, and you can use it as your own visual guide or template. And we'll talk about ways to do that. You can also create and customize quick guides for yourself. And a quick guide, it provides you with a structure or system for evaluating and annotating mentor texts. And the reason it's important to customize it is because you are looking at text for a specific purpose in your field. So you may want to ask different questions of yourself as you're evaluating it. It can also, a quick guide can also be in the form of a checklist just to help you keep track of, okay, have I looked at the aspects of the introduction? Have I identified the way the overall document is structured? Have I identified what kind of reference and citation style they use, and so forth? So the first section is questions, just very broad questions to ask yourself in terms of creating a list of mentor texts. Now, I'm not saying that every single one of these approaches will work for each of you, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes some will work better and some won't. But if you do this, do it really mindfully. So the first thing is considering these questions. Do I want to organize my list by categories? And I highly recommend doing that. What types or genres of text are produced in my field? We've talked about that. Those can become your categories. Components of different texts can become categories. But there are two other questions. Will the texts I write, the manuscripts and papers that I write, change over time as I advance in my career? Okay, my scope of practice, what I do, what I'm responsible for will also shift and change. So for instance, in 5 or 10 years, will I be writing policy? Will I be writing editorials? Will I be doing quality improvement and assessment projects? Or will I continue publishing and writing a very standard set of research articles? All of that is perfectly valid. So there are different examples of how you can format your list. One is to, for instance, you could focus only on one category, such as scholarly journals, and then break the sort of the subcategories into the types of documents that you see published in these journals, such as research studies, literature reviews, and so forth. And the other way you could do it is focusing on different types of genre elements, components that you've excerpted from different published documents. For example, this may seem obvious, but how many times have we struggled to create an effective title? Something that our readers will go, oh, this is interesting, I'm going to read more about it, rather than, oh, I've seen it all before. Titles are the first way you invite your readers in or not. So this can be, having a list of sample titles that you found effective can be helpful. Abstracts, aim statements, or hypotheses, discussion passages. There are all sorts of ways all sorts of components you can pull out of a document. So you can create a list and categorized by these kinds of components as well. And I just gave you, this is just a very quick example. For instance, abstracts in scholarly journal articles. And the reason I separated this out there could be abstracts for, say, conference presentations, and you might want to separate that out. And then enough information that you remember what you got that sample excerpt from, and then maybe a note about what it does well, or a note about what it doesn't do well. Even though you will see publications or abstracts published, doesn't always mean they're effectively written or they're as effective as they could be. And this is also a good area to work with at the Academic Writing Center to work with the experts there as well about identifying elements that might work well or not so well in a specific abstract for a specific journal paper. Another aspect is to create a guide for evaluating mentor texts. The purpose of a checklist is to list important points that you want to consider when you're diagramming and analyzing your own mentor text. So you can organize it in whatever way works for you. And I just put some samples here. What I'm seeing this as is, okay, I'm going to look through this document and there are various things I want to make sure I've looked at. I might want to add notes to myself, especially down here if I'm also thinking about larger issues, such as who is my intended audience? Who is this targeted to? There will be secondary readers, but I have to have a specific group of people in mind, a specific audience in mind as well, so I can identify their expectations. There are now two sets of questions that I have. One is about discipline-specific conventions. Again, with both sets of questions, these are sample questions that I would expect you to customize and add to for your own purposes. But questions like these help you focus on discipline-specific conventions. So it's like starting with things like, how do researchers in your discipline communicate knowledge in writing? So you're thinking about, how is information, how is knowledge presented in this kind of document? Take time to really try to articulate that to yourself, because we tend to kind of intuitively internalize this without, and it can be hard to really express how that process happens. Another is, how do researchers in your discipline establish credibility? I'm going to show you something very quickly. If you look at this is from an article, sort of a case analysis from the Transnational Environmental Law. I believe that's the journal. But look at how footnotes are used. If you're in history or anthropology or any kind of or legal, a lot of times in case law, you'll see that part of establishing credibility and communicating knowledge is the use of lengthy descriptive footnotes. There might also be a bibliography or reference at the end of the document, but there's a great deal of information that would interrupt the flow if it were incorporated into the paragraph that it refers back to. But that is has a lot of valuable information that readers can check. Another example, though, would be a social science article. You can see here that, I don't mean to give you a headache, you can see that they're using a different kind of citation format here, where it's in-text citations. It's very similar. I think it's the social sciences style. It's very similar in some ways to other author date systems of doing in-text citations. So you just have the citation here and the references at the end. So as you can see, there's different ways of establishing credibility and of using reference style conventions depending on your field. So here, these are the kinds of things I'm asking here. So what methods do researchers in your discipline use to collect information? How do they describe these methods in writing? This can also, it can relate to how gathered information is, how data is analyzed. And there's a lot of times in a lot of disciplines, data will be presented as tables because there's a lot of numeric data, but there's also going to have to be some kind of narrative accompanying that table that sort of contextualizes that information. So how are those written? Looking at say you find an example of a narrative accompanying a table that's really effective, that really keeps you engaged. That might be a great template to excerpt, an example to excerpt, and to look at and kind of see if you can start by mimicking that style, imitating that style. But it's not in order to just have them do, you're not imitating the ideas. What you're doing is internalizing the way people are not only using syntactical or language structural components, but also how they're logically connecting the flow of ideas. So these questions are ones that help you start thinking about discipline-specific conventions in your area. These are additional sample questions, and they can be good starting points if you are simply trying to get a feel for a text. Think about how you might be able to use some of these questions. If they're not useful for you, or if some are, but some aren't, delete the ones that aren't, and maybe replace them with questions that make more sense to you. So you can, again, customize these lists in any way you want. The other thing is, you can excerpt, just copy and paste sections into a blank document for yourself. And that's another way you can, for instance, use these questions, in separate, for separate documents for separate mentor texts. So we're going to look at some exemplars. First of all, going back to just reminding you of selecting mentor text from a variety of sources, of journals, and so forth. We're going to look at a scholarly journal article for organization and content, or a couple of them, and then we're going to look at the organization and content of a couple of abstracts, and then a short passage thinking about coherence and language conventions. So we'll start with using conventions in a discipline to give us context. And so I want you thinking about these as we move into our first samples. So kind of keep these questions in mind, and you can have your handout at the ready available. So we're going to look at a paper from sociology, social sciences, and cognitive linguistics. And after that, I'm going to have you take a paper from your own discipline and do a little bit of diagramming. We're going to skip over the abstract overall for a minute. We'll come back to that. But what I want you thinking about to start with is what you might consider to be sort of the obvious elements. Think about how the title not only presents specific information and sets up the overall focus of the draft, the paper, but also might be repeated in some ways in keywords. The abstract, where is the purpose statement within that abstract? So see if you can locate a purpose statement. So when I was looking at it, I was seeing this as their purpose statement. And in this case, what they're doing is stating an argument. Drawing on pragmatism, we propose the concept of plausible futures to capture how people rearrange elements within cultural repertoires as a practical and moral project to define their identities, aspirations, and goals. So if I were to ask you to list the purpose or argument, that might be something that you would pay attention to. As you move through, if we're just thinking of organization and structure, we're first looking at the way the overall organization happens. And is it in some ways, we're thinking back to the abstract. Is it aligned with the way it was set out in the abstract? But so you've got major subheadings and you've got, or major headings and subheadings. And then within these, you've got sections of content. You know this, I know that. But what I want you thinking about as you look at the content is, what is the focus? What is the purpose of this content? So what is it trying to do? And what is it focusing on in terms of how to accomplish that purpose? Is it, for instance, demonstrating one element of the research, one aspect of the background, what has already been found in the research? Is it looking at a social or cultural trend? Whatever it's doing. You can look at, I'm moving, you can look at various statements that are made to identify ideas, but you can look at how diagrams are used, but just focus mostly on headings, subheadings, and understanding what's going on in your particular document. You can use then statements that they make within the document to identify, again, the purpose and focus of a particular area, or to identify an element that you wanted to find, an argument in this case. So another document that I want you to look at just very quickly is a cognitive linguistics article. There's the title, and you can look to see how it communicates what the potential overall focus is. And you can look at the abstract to see if you can identify that overall topic or argument or purpose statement in this case. We make a case for discourse-oriented research and so forth. You can look to see if the title also includes keywords down here. And then if you look, you'll see that this particular article is set up in more of a standard IMRAD format, IMRAD, or introduction, methods, results, analysis, and discussion. It's set up in a format loosely related to IMRAD, which I think many of you are probably familiar with. So as you go through, you would make note of each heading, and you would see, look at how it's separated. So the introduction component is also, the background is kind of giving that background context, how that's broken down, and then sort of the purpose and focus of each subsection. And as you work through it, you get a sense again of the way this document is structured for this particular journal. So you'll see that there's it's very lengthy, as is the other document, but it's broken down with very specific subheadings to guide the reader through. So after going through this fairly lengthy introduction and background, we get to the M of IMRAD, the methods, and they call it data and method. So they're going to talk about, obviously, how who they worked with, their sample group, how they collected information, what that information was, and so forth. So all of the things that are in a more standard IMRAD structure. They also use figures and other graphical information to present some of the data. And you want to think about that too as you're looking at your sample mentor text. How are they visually presenting data? And then how do they talk about the data in the various tables and figures? So again, you're kind of going through this, and findings and discussion And then, so there was methods and analysis, findings and discussion. And then there are also conclusions. So as you start by separating these chunks out, it slows you down. So this isn't about going, oh, I didn't know that. Obviously, you know that. There are different ways of, these are very standard or common ways of organizing information, but they all have variation depending on the purpose and discipline in which the document is used. So what I want you to do is review. You're going to start by pulling this article out. Again, you are going to, and on, you can either use a highlighter or on an underline or on a separate piece of paper, or even in notes, or pasting, copying and pasting into a blank document. But find a way to separate out and list the title, and then from the abstract, the overarching purpose statement, argument, or thesis statement, and then the section headings and subheadings from the body. So copy and paste these into a blank document, or that would be quicker than writing them out. But take a minute to just do that. And then under each section heading and subhead, under each section heading, make a note of the purpose of that section. Once you do that, you're going to look under each subsection heading and note the focus of the content in that section. And if there are no headings that kind of break subsections down, look at paragraphs and how they kind of expand on the content in that particular section. How are the methods broken down if it's not in the more standard participant setting, data collection, and all of that? How basically what I'm asking you to do is think about not only how is my document, this document that I've pulled from one of my sample journals, how is it organized and structured, but why? Why is it set up like that? So you're really thinking about why you have to do, or why the writer had to do particular steps, takes particular steps with the content in each section. And then once you're done, you want to consider how the organization of the article reflects conventions of logic and structure that might be expected by readers in your discipline, and that would contribute to the writer's credibility as a scholar and researcher. So how is audience considered? How is the writer establishing and maintaining credibility? As you work through this, what did you notice in the organizational details of the article that you were diagramming? Hopefully that also really kind of gave you some insights about, oh, okay, it shows you how you could structure a literature review or some other kind of review, and maybe that's where those kind of separate, kind of independent but yet connected by a historical thread sections come in. So what you're seeing is how documents in your different fields can be organized according to an argument, a thematic, overall analytical theme, an expansion of knowledge in a particular area. Excellent. So you'll notice that IMRAD structure that I mentioned, some of you will not see that, or will see a very loose description of it. And partly that's because that structure is more commonly used in the sciences. So especially the health sciences and hard sciences, like life sciences, that sort of thing, and also in some other fields. So you'll see that there's a huge variety of ways to structure an article. So rather than trying to figure out the magical formula, you look at the particular journal, just like you're doing, and identify some strong articles in it, and they become your mentor text in the organizational conventions. So my next question to you is, what other writing genres in your field could you apply a similar kind of diagramming strategy to? To add to that, how might you adapt or customize this strategy? Say, for instance, you're looking at a book in your field and you want to do a book review, and you can still look at mentor texts of book reviews and diagram them, but how might you could think about, how might I adapt my strategy for that kind of genre? So keep that question in mind. How can I apply these strategies, not just with one? Don't lock yourself into one kind of document. We're going to look at the same those same articles, but just the abstracts now in them. So you're going to do a similar activity, but now you're really focusing it on abstracts because, and this may be surprising to some of you, but abstracts can be very difficult to write well. And I'm sure some of you can probably relate to that, especially if you're doing it across languages or for different journals or different purposes. So looking again at the way abstracts are presented in your particular discipline can be very helpful. So what I did here really was I went through and diagrammed this abstract. This is for the article in Sociological Science, the same one about looking at cultural trends and patterns and how youth draw on them for particular purposes. But I'm not saying that my identifications are totally, that you might agree with them. So if you have different perspectives on the purpose of each of these sentences, please add them, because this can sometimes be an issue with abstracts. But I'm going to read it aloud. Sorry, I'm going to read it aloud first. This article analyzes how young adults draw on cultural resources to understand their identities, aspirations, and goals when taken for granted scripts of success are perceived as less desirable or achievable. So when I was looking at this, I was thinking, well, this sentence seems to provide an overall or underlying rationale, their underlying reasoning for this. And so it's it's implying a bit of background context. And so it's a short statement, but it's situating us in the context. Then I identified the next sentence as their kind of statement of their argument, or they say their proposition. Drawing on pragmatism, we propose the concept of plausible futures to capture how people rearrange elements within cultural repertoires as practical and moral project to define their identities, aspirations, and goals. So what I was looking at to identify the kind of that this was stating an argument or so forth was the language. We propose, drawing on pragmatism, giving me a context, but then that phrase, we propose, that tells me, they're presenting an argument. Then we get into what appear to be methods. We draw on interviews with 80 college students concerning how they understand their future aspirations. They take us through what they talked about and who they interviewed and what they discussed during those interviews, and how they collected their information. That's all methods. So I identified that as methods. And then I looked at this statement: we find. Sometimes they don't make it easy for you in abstracts, but here it's very clear we find that. So that indicates these are some findings, things that they've inferred or results that they've gathered. In this case, they're looking at sort of thematic results and findings. And they blend that into, here are sort of our thematic results, and here are our analyses of these results. So it's kind of a blend of that. And then they go to the sort of outcomes and conclusions. The combining of elements from each repertoire enables, so forth. We show that respondents combine, and so forth. So again, I'm kind of looking at the language because I'm not an expert in this field. And even if you're looking at an article in your field, you may not have expertise in the particular focus. But this is where you start looking at how the organization of the content and the language used to introduce each section or of the abstract can kind of sometimes give you a clue to what its purpose is. So here I got a little bit more colorful. And I was looking again at how they kind of, in my head, I have a sense of a general abstract organization, that it's starting usually with context and then very quickly, usually, coming to a purpose. And then moving through how they gathered, a process they used for gathering their information and how they interpret it and what they've concluded from it. So that will show up in a variety of ways. Here, the background is in this short statement. The focus of much sensory language research has been on vocabulary and codability, not how language is used in communication of sensory perceptions. So you can see that the background in the abstract isn't always a long section. Sometimes it's just one sentence. Generally, 1 to 3 sentences will be enough. And then this is their sort of purpose statement. We make a case for discourse-oriented research about sensory language as an alternative to the prevailing vocabulary orientation. They then go into methods, not necessarily saying our methods were, but what you do is you look for clues. So to consider this, in other words, to find out, information, we presented participants. So we've got the word participants, we've got what they were presented with, everyday sounds, what they were asked to do, how this material was explored with the participant, or how the participants used language to describe these sounds, and so forth. This is all about a methodology, steps they took, the process they took to gather the information they wanted. Here they again make it easy for us by saying the results show. So here that language tells us, okay, we're looking at results. But if that language wasn't there, you might look here and say, okay, are there inferences being drawn now? Are they focusing on, what they learned from the methods, or in terms of results, actual objective data they collected? And then finally, conclusions and discussion are our study highlights that in order to account for sensory language use, we need an analytical framework that accommodates discursive language in a non-trivial way, and so forth. So this is also a great statement about implications for future research. What is needed now? What are some next steps? This highlights steps that they themselves can take as researchers. So what we're going to do now is take a minute to try that out on your own. So you can look at the same article, or if you have a different article that you pulled, you can pull an abstract from the article, and then label the sections in the same way as best you can. So look for sections on background or context, a sentence or statement that has a purpose or an argument, a proposition, and then anything about a process or methods undertaking to, say, answer their sort of research question that's embedded in that purpose statement or argument, and whether there are findings or results or specific discussion about those, and any conclusions drawn, implications. So kind of label those sections, and you don't have to label them in this way. This is just one example of how you could label them. You could separate things out too, in different ways. It's what is presented in front of you. So what is that abstract you're looking at say? How is it organized? And then write down the rationale for each of these sections that you identify in that abstract. Again, what is the point? What is its underlying purpose? What is it being used to do for the reader? And then see if you can identify the corresponding sections of the article and whether those sections align with the abstract. So obviously the sections will greatly expand on the skeleton of the abstract, but do those sections align in purpose and focus with the kind of claims or ideas made in that abstract? So we're going to look at one more kind of mentor text to work with. This is one that may seem almost really kind of, grade school, but there's a very useful purpose. It's called imitation, or in ancient Latin, it was imitatio. And it was actually a technique used by the ancient Romans to teach structure and form and ways of expression in oratory. This was spoken, but the same kind of concept can be applied in writing. But let's, for example, say that maybe you struggled a little bit, or you were still not sure in your use of English language, that your abstracts were as concrete. What you could do is break that into a template like this, adapting it for your own purpose. So here I have a passage that it's very logical, very well organized. I believe this was from a computer science journal. I'm not worried about whether I'm an expert in the topic as long as I have an understanding of the structure and its purpose. And so what I did was I just excerpted it as an example. And in it, I'll read it quickly. In addition to decision trees, other artificial intelligence techniques, such as neural networks, genetic algorithms, simulated annealing, ant colony algorithms, particle swarm algorithms, gray wolf blah, 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 are used to obtain the transformation rules. So for anyone who is an expert in this area, all those different kinds of algorithms make perfect sense. But for our purpose, it's more about looking at the structure. So what you can do is take the generic phrasing in addition to other techniques such as blah, blah, and blah are used to. These are all very generic phrases, and you can rephrase even the generic phrasing too. But what you then have is a template for one particular statement describing a particular approach to something or defining something. It depends on the statement that you've chosen. So gathering and creating a selection of these kinds of templates can be very, very useful. For purposes of time, I just did this short one, but for you, it might be more effective to work with an abstract. So I'm actually going to ask you to do that using the abstract you worked with earlier. Start by removing the content specific to the original article and leaving blank spaces, just like we did, so that only generic statements remain. Then start with that. And if you have time, try inserting content specific to maybe a study or other kind of assignment maybe that you're working on. See if you can put some topical information from your area of study into the blank spaces, and then try rephrasing the generic content. So again, the purpose is not just to internalize the use of language, but also the internal flow of logic, coherence, how ideas are connected. I want to quickly give you talk to you about thinking about when you're compiling your own collection, think about what works best for you. So, do you prefer digital, hard copy, or both? What kinds of categories do you want to use to organize your material? Do you prefer guiding questions, diagramming, checklists? Then decide on how you want to compile your collection of texts based on your preferences.